recording. And now I'm going to stream my desktop, so you'll be able to see everything. And let's check to see that the recording is still going. Okay, that looks fine. All right, so I'm going to go over to After Effects. This is what it should look like when you first get started. So I have this kind of like uh, dialog window on top of After Effects that is kind of like, you know, where I'm going to create a new project, or if you open it for the first time, you may see some links to tutorials and stuff like that. And there's a lot of really good built-in tutorials, so I definitely recommend checking those out. Once we're here, I'm just going to click on New Project. And I thought this would take me to a different dialog where I set the settings, but maybe that's just Photoshop. Okay. So we're in the new project, and so this interface, it should look a little bit familiar in terms of the basic Adobe setup, but it obviously is also quite different because it's a different thing that we're going to be working on. So there's a few sections in the default interface. Just like Photoshop, there are a few different default workspaces. So this is the default workspace here, but there's all sorts of different types of workspaces that you might use for different things. So for example, if you were doing some motion tracking or something like that, you could open the motion tracking workspace, and that looks pretty much the same, except there's a tracker panel over here. But then I can go back to default, and then I can move stuff around. If I want to move my project window over here for some reason, I could do that and have a larger composition window. Then I can move it back. So I can customize any components of the interface that I want to. And then if I screw something up, I can always just go back to reset default. If I create something that I really like, I can also go to workspace and go to save as new workspace to create my own type of workspace. But I'm pretty happy with the default here, so I'm just going to stick with this. So then looking at the workspace, the top section is the toolbar, where we have different types of tools, and we'll look at these. We won't cover all of these today, but we'll look at a few of them just to get started. And then, so below that, I have my project panel. This is where I'm going to kind of deal with my my files, like my compositions, any footage that I might use from like a video source or an image source. Anything like that is going to go in this project panel over here. This composition is like the main window in Photoshop. This is where we're actually going to see what our animation looks like. And right now we don't have anything here, so we don't see anything, but we will in a second. Over on the right here, we have a bunch of different properties. So we have audio if we want to add some audio. We have effects if we want to put effects in there. There's stuff for text and lots of other things over here that we can edit. And then down here at the bottom is our timeline. And this is where we do all of our editing. Obviously, there's nothing in here right now, so we don't see anything, but we'll start to see different layers here, and then we'll also use the timeline to add keyframes and create animation properties and things like that. So that's the basic interface, and as I go over creating your first composition, you're going to see how all of these different panels kind of play into workflow. So to get started, I'm just going to click on this big new composition button. There's two options here, composition from footage. That's what I would use if I had some video footage that I was adding effects on top of, like if I was adding, a title or credits to a video, or if I was adding some type of visual effects, I would start with new composition. But I don't have any footage to start with, so I'm just going to click on new composition, and I'm going to make my own footage. And I'm going to call this composition my main composition. And then there's some basic presets here. You can pretty much leave them the same. There's only one that we really want to change. But let's take a look at them real quick. Sorry, just a second. Okay. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so the first preset is the first option is our preset. And so we can change this and it'll change the other parameters for us. So The default preset is 1920 by 1080. That is HD standard video. That's what most of the video that you see on web-based sources like YouTube are going to be 1920 by 1080. 4K is the higher uh, uh, quality standard that you might see on like broadcast television or in a movie theater or something like that. You might see 4K or 8K. And then there's different qualities for different things. Like they have some social media presets, they have video and film presets, but we're pretty much good to go with the basic HD 1920 by 1080 preset. So we can see the width is 1920 pixels, the height is 1080 pixels. That's basically what pretty much every YouTube video you're ever going to see is set to, unless it's a newer video and it has 4K. And that's the 16 by 9 aspect ratio. So 16 by 9 describes how wide it is relative to how tall it is. Pixel aspect ratio, we don't have to worry about this because we're making digital video, so our pixels are all squares. This is something that may have been different if you were using different types of television sets back in the broadcast days. For the frame rate, 29.97 is kind of the standard, 30 frames per second. You could set it to 24 or something like that, but there's no real reason to change anything there. The one thing that we do probably want to change is this duration. So the default is 30 seconds. You can see with this time code, it starts with the hour, then the minute, then the seconds, and then frames. And so we don't really need to do 30 seconds, so you can change this to 10. You can always edit it later, but I'm going to go ahead and change that to 10. And then you can set the background color of your composition. This is just what's going to be visible if you don't have anything else on the screen. So we can set that to black. You could change it if you want, but black should be fine. So I'm good with all those settings. I don't really need to change anything except for the duration. So then I can just click OK. And so now we can see our composition is here. It's just black because it's just a black background and we haven't added anything on top of here. And so that's our composition. There's a couple settings here. The size, right now it's set to default, so it says fit up to 100%. If you want to zoom in, you could set this to 100%. And then you can also zoom in and out using the scroll wheel on the mouse if you have a scroll wheel or on your trackpad. But usually if you just say fit up to 100, that's going to be fine. That way, if I increase the size of the window, the composition will with it. So that's fine. There's also a setting for the quality. So right now the quality is set to half. That means that when it's playing it back, it's not going to be rendering at full quality. That means that it can render a little bit faster as we add like different edits and stuff like that. So half is probably a good setting there. If it's going really slow, you could try a third or a quarter. Or if you don't have that much stuff going on, you might set it to full quality. But whatever the defaults there are usually fine. You can also show different color channels. We don't really need to do that. And we can take a snapshot if we want to. And so yeah, those are the settings there. We don't really need to change a whole lot here. What we are going to do is start to add stuff into our timeline. So right now, there's nothing in the timeline. We do see this is the called the playhead, this blue little triangle, which we can move back and forth to set the time of the animation. And then there's these two different sort of timeline things here. This one on the top is going to change where I see the timeline. And this one on the bottom is going to change the playback. So if I move this around, it's going to set that, it's called the work area. And so that's where it's going to play. So for now, I'm just going to leave these both as covering the full 10 seconds. And if we need to, we can adjust those. Okay. So that's the basic setup. Let's go ahead and add some footage to our composition. So footage is like basically anything. It could be video footage. It could be a shape. It could be a piece of text. Anything that you add into the composition is going to be referred to as footage. And so we're going to create this footage from scratch inside of the program. So I'm going to go up to Layer, New, and you can see under here, there's different types of content that I can add. I can add text. A solid is just a background color. I can add shapes, and I can add other types of effects like an adjustment layer, things like that that may be kind of talked about with Photoshop. Um, I can add lighting and camera. We probably won't go over those because we're not going to be doing 3D stuff, but you could do some 3D stuff with lighting and camera. And then you can add Photoshop files where it actually separates out the layers and you can animate the layers separately. So it works really well with both Photoshop and Illustrator files if you want to take content that you Photoshop and put it into After Effects. So I'm just going to start with the most basic property here, the solid. And so a solid is just a big square that fills up the whole screen. And so I'm going to choose a color. And for this one, we're supposed to be doing something based on emotions. So if I want to do something that's like kind of sad, I could use like a blue color. You don't have to do an emotion, but that's a good kind of prompt as a starting point. So I might do like a sort of neutral blue color. And then I'm going to click make it the size of the composition so it fills up the whole page. And then just click OK. And you see it created a layer that fills up my entire animation. So now when I play this back, so I'm just hitting the space bar, and you can see nothing's changing because I just have this one big solid. So let's look at a few properties of the layer, and then we'll talk about ways that we can actually animate. So this little red section is the layer, and I can change the timing of this layer by dragging it back and forth. And then if I click on the edges, or if I hover over on the edges, this is pretty small, so it may be hard to see. Let me actually see. I should have done this earlier, but let's try to change the interface setting. Um, let's see, window. Yeah, I don't really think there are. Okay, let's see. File. Yeah, there's no like editor settings. Preferences. Maybe under here. Appearance. I don't really think that there are. I don't remember ever seeing this, but it's worth checking. Yeah, I don't think there's any way to make the interface larger. Anyway, I'll look later, but hopefully you guys can see this. So when I hover over the edge of this red layer here, my mouse turns into like a little arrow thing, and I can actually drag the end of this. So if I want to make this blue background shorter, this will determine the duration of this clip. So now if I line this up with the beginning of my clip, it starts out as blue, but then you'll see it's going to cut off and go back to black. So I can change the overall duration of one of these clips. If I go in here, if I right click on it, I have a lot of options. Let's see. I can change the time. I can add all this stuff on here. And let's see, if I double click on it, it'll open it in its own composition window, so I can actually edit the layer by itself. But let's go back to here. I'm just going to make this the same size and stretch it out down here. Okay. So for the background, I want to do just a very simple animation. I'm going to go over to the properties in the timeline over here. So these are all really, really small, so it may be hard to see this, but hopefully you guys can see it. First thing I'm going to do is just rename this. So I'm going to rename this background. And then you'll notice up in my project panel up here, under the solids, they created this folder for me. And you can see the solid is right here. So I can actually drag this down and create a new one. Or I can drag this up here. If I make some changes that I want to keep, I can drag this over here, although it doesn't think it wants. I guess I can't do that. Anyway, it's going to just automatically add new footage to this folder up here next to my main composition. Okay, so let's do a very simple animation. I'm just going to fade this blue color in over a couple seconds. So it's going to fade from black to blue. Make sure it covers them. So to access these properties, there's a little tiny little arrow next to here. And if I click on that, you're going to see the transform properties. And then if I click on the arrow next to there, you're going to see all of the properties that I can animate. And there are a ton of different properties. And this is just one basic shape. So you can imagine that there's lots of different properties that you can animate. So that's part of what makes animating stuff take a long time, is there's just a lot of different properties that we can work with. So the transform section has a bunch of different properties. I can change the scale, I can rotate, I can change the opacity. That's what we're going to use for our fade in and fade out. I can change the position, and I can change the anchor point. Another way that I can access that menu, if I click on the layer and then I hit T, that brings up opacity. There's different key commands for all of the different properties. If I hit P, that brings up position. If I hit O, oh, that doesn't do what I thought it would do. Excuse me. I thought O was going to do opacity, but it looks like T is opacity. I guess because T is for transparent, but they use opacity. Let's see. A is for the anchor point. And let's see if we can get scale. S is scale. R is rotation. T is opacity. T is position. If I hit T again, or if I hit any of the commands again, it goes away. If I have a command open and I hit U, it goes away. And then there's one to open all of them, but I thought that was T. Not sure which one it is now. I'll just try some other keys. Probably doing weird stuff by accident. Yeah, I'm making all sorts of random changes, but I can always do undo. So it doesn't look like there is a way to open all of them with a key command. So I'm just Control Z, undoing all of these random changes that I've made. Oh, whoops, I went a little too far. Okay, now I'm Control Shift Zing this back into place. But it looks like there it is. Okay. So I just closed my composition. So I open the composition again. And so now let's go ahead and finish this animation. Okay. So I'm going to select my layer. I'm going to hit T to open up the transparency or opacity property. And here's where we can actually create an animation. So this is the most important part to remember. So each one of my properties has a value, which is this number, which I can turn up or down either by dragging the mouse on top of it or just putting in a specific number. So 0 opacity means we don't see the color at all, and 100 means we see all of the color. Okay, so that's how I can change the value. So let's say I want to change it from 0 at 1 frame, and then when I move up to here, I want it to go to 100. That's basically what After Effects can do for me. It can do the math to take the value from take the property from one value to the next. So the way that I do that is by using this little stopwatch button. This is going to add a keyframe. So I'm actually going to move up to the 2-second mark, which is where I want my fade in to stop, because this is where it's 100%, and I'm going to click the keyframe. And so notice this added this very little diamond-shaped thing in here, which I can click on. I can actually move this around, but this basically says at this moment, this property should be 100%. So I've created one keyframe. This doesn't actually do anything, but what I can do is create a new keyframe, and that is going to make After Effects do the math to go from one value to the next. So now I'm going to drag my playhead all the way back to the beginning. And now I'm going to set this number to 0. And since I had one keyframe, notice that it already adds another keyframe for me. I don't have to click the stopwatch again. So you only have to click the stopwatch the first time to basically say I want there to be keyframes. And then anytime I change a value, it'll either add a keyframe or change the keyframe at that position. So if I click the stopwatch again, the keyframes disappear. That's not what I want. I only want to click the stopwatch once, and then I can just add new keyframes. Whoops, I can add new keyframes by just changing the value and moving the playhead. And I can move between the keyframes using the little keyframe arrows here. Okay, so now that is going to create a simple fade-in animation as the opacity goes from 0 to 100. So I'm going to hit play, and we can watch that. Okay, so that was very, very exciting. We see that animation happen. Okay, so a couple other things that I can do here. There's some other parameters here. There's some effects. There's frame blending. There's motion blur. There's an adjustment layer. There's a 3D layer. There's all sorts of different stuff I can do under here. But the button right here next to the opacity, this opens up a graph editor set for me. So if I go up here, I can open up this little graph editor section. And here, this gets a little bit more complicated, and we'll go over this in a little more detail in a later class. But that line basically shows you the value over time. So without that, we just see 0 here and then 100 here. But if you want to fine grain look at how that value changes over time, you can see the line here. So 0 is at the bottom and 100 is at the top. And as I move through the animation, you see that value change. So at any point in the animation, the value is going to be on that line. You can change the way that line looks. We're not going to get into that today because it's a little more advanced, but we'll get into that soon. So I'm going to get rid of the graph editor for now, and I'm going to turn this off. And let's finish our animation. So I have the fade in, and then it's just blue, and I want it to fade out at the end. I'm going to do a slightly shorter fade out. And so I'm going to add a keyframe at the very end. I'm going to move my playhead all the way to the end, and then I'm going to drag my opacity down to 0. And so here's another important thing. So I want my opacity to go from 100 down to 0, but I don't want it to go like I don't want it to start at 2 seconds, because then it's just fading out the whole time and it goes slowly. So what I want to do is I want to hold on this 100% value for a long time. And so what I need to do first is move to where I want the fade to start. And then I can just click the keyframe button again to add a new keyframe here. And then I can set that value back to 100. So now I'm going to have fade up to 100. And then it holds at 100. And now it fades back to 0. And if we want to see that over time, you can see in the graph editor, there we go, that's our animation. And I can actually edit this. So I can grab this one and drag it over here if I want. Or I can drag this one back here. So you can use the graph editor to animate, but we don't really need to do that quite yet. So then another way that I could do this, if I delete this keyframe, so I'm just going to delete a keyframe, I just select the keyframe and hit the delete key on the keyboard. Now it's gone. I can actually copy and paste keyframes as well. So I can right click on this keyframe and go to, oh, I don't see copy on here. Okay, maybe I just have to hit Control C. Maybe if I go to edit, okay, let's see. So if I hit Control C and then move over here and Control V, there we go. So I have another keyframe. I can drag this down here and we get the same effect. So it doesn't show up in that context menu, but I can Control C, Control V, or on a Mac, Command C, Command V to copy keyframe. I can also copy more than one keyframe. So if I select both of these free keyframes and hit Control C to copy, notice my playhead is over here, so it's going to copy to where the playhead is. Now I hit Control V to paste. Now we get those keyframes, those same two keyframes again. So we're going to fade in, but then this keyframe is 0, so it fades back to 0, then back up to 1 or 100, and then back down to 0. You can copy multiple keyframes if you want to repeat an animation more than once. Okay, so this is a lot. Even though we barely really scratched the surface, this is already a lot of stuff to remember. So I'm just going to do one more example, and then I'll let you guys work on your own for the rest of the class. So let's add a shape in here. Okay, so that's a little bit trickier, but I'll show you guys how to do that. So I have my background. I'm going to go ahead and lock the background. So just like in Photoshop, we can lock this if we want to make it so that we can't click on it and make changes by accident. So I'm going to lock that background. And then I'm going to go to Layer and say New. And I'm going to add a shape layer. And so on this layer, I can draw whatever I want using my tools up here. So I'm just going to use a basic rectangle tool. You actually have a bunch of tools here. So I have different shapes that I can use here. I have a pen tool like in Illustrator. If I want to draw something, I can use the pen tool. I have a type tool, so I can create text here. I also have a brush if I want to do some painting. I have a clone and a eraser tool. So there's a lot of stuff I can use here. These tools are not quite as sophisticated as the ones that you get through Illustrator and Photoshop. So if you have like a really detailed thing that you want to make, I would recommend making it in Photoshop or Illustrator first and then bringing it over here. But for just basic stuff, you can use the shapes in here. So let's do a polygon. And so I can draw a polygon and I can set, there's some properties up here. So I can set the fill if I want to make a different color. I can set the stroke if I want to make a color for the stroke. I can increase the size of the stroke. So this is just like in Illustrator. We have the fill as the middle and the stroke is the outside. I can also just turn the stroke off. I can turn this into a Bezier path. I can add other components to this. And let's see. I can make the shape into a mask by using this button, but that's a little advanced. I'm not going to do that quite yet. Let's see if there's some other properties over here. There should be like a... trying to see if there's something to change the number of sides in the polygon. I don't see it. Okay, anyway, once I make the shape, I can go back and use the arrow tool to move the shape around or edit different parts. Like if I drag on these different squares, I can change the size, the width, and the height. I can also, if I kind of move to the outside, I can rotate. And then also notice this little guy in the middle. This is the anchor right here. Notice that that's where it rotates around. So if I rotate here, it's going to rotate around wherever that anchor is. So there's another tool up here, which is the anchor point tool. So if I grab that and I move the anchor point over there, and then go back to the arrow tool, notice that the shape now rotates around that anchor. Okay, so that might be, closer to the type of animation that you want to make. Okay, so let's just animate that rotation property for a second. So I'm gonna go down. So inside my shape layer, there's actually more information in here than with our background. So you can see the contents is this star. And so I can actually change the values of the star here. So I have this like path to polygon. I can actually change the number of points here. And so I can animate the number of points over time. So let's set the number of points to 3. I can change the position. I can do all this stuff in here. But then it also has what's called the transform. And this is what we animated before with the anchor point, the position, scale, rotation, and opacity. So the transform can animate the shape itself as a whole, whereas the contents of the shape can be animated as well. I can change the stroke. I can animate all the different properties of the stroke, which there's a ton of properties. I can animate the fill, so I can change the color and other properties of the fill. And then I can change other properties within there. So there's a lot of different stuff I can do in here with the shape itself, but then I can also transform the layer itself. So on the layer, I can have multiple shapes. So let's add another shape in here. Let's do a little ellipse over here. So now notice that I have the ellipse and the polystar. So I have two shapes in here. If I change the rotation, it's going to rotate both shapes around that anchor. Okay, so I can rotate everything on the layer, or I can go to one of the shapes and I can animate just that shape. So here's the rotation of just the polygon. So there's a lot of different properties that I can rotate here. So it can be a little bit tricky to keep track of all of those properties and which one you can animate. So let's just animate the rotation of the entire layer. So I'm going to move the layer over a little bit. So it starts a little bit after we start fading in. Then we'll see our shapes appear. And let's go to here and keyframe the rotation. And then I'm just going to go to another point in my timeline. And I'm just going to, I could either just rotate around like this, or since it's a rotation, eventually we're going to come back to the beginning. This 0 here is actually just like one full rotation. And so I can do multiple rotations like that. So we have one full rotation. If I change this to like 8, it's going to do 8 rotations, so that's going to be really fast. Oh no, I accidentally added another keyframe. So that's something that you're going to do a lot by mistake. I didn't move my timeline to the keyframe I wanted to change. So what I did is I actually just created a different keyframe. So I want that one to stay 0. What I want to do is go here. And I want to change this first number to 8. Okay, now it's going to rotate around. Okay, so that's kind of cool. There's a whole lot of other stuff to go over, but hopefully this is enough for you guys to kind of get started. I'm just going to save the file on my computer real quick, and then I'm going to give you guys the rest of the class to work on just playing around with After Effects. So I'm going to go to my desktop, go to my MMP 100 folder. I'm starting a new project, so I'm going to create a new folder here. So I can right click and go to new folder. And I'm going to call this animated emotions, and open that up. And I'm just going to call this is my main project, so I'm just going to call this main.aep and save here. And so that AEP file is kind of like our Photoshop file. We need that to be able to open this up and add more edits. Okay, so I've covered some of the basics, how to add a layer, how to create a composition, how to do a very simple animation. There's a lot of other stuff that you can do in After Effects, and a lot of it won't make that much sense until you begin to explore it on your own. So let's start that now. I'm going to stop the recording here, and then we can have some workshop time. And of course, if you guys have questions, we can go over anything that you need.